I get so excited I cut the call off. They call back, and I said, yes, I am. And the President Obama comes on the phone and said, man, you did great. Congratulations. Oh, no. You carried Richmond by 50,000 votes. There's a town in Maine, Richmond, Maine, it has 2,000 people. How do you tell the President of the United States he's talking to the wrong guy? Somebody had handed him the phone, said, Senator-elect Kaine, and King, you know.
Angus is telling stories.
He's a very good storyteller.
Yes, he is a very good storyteller. So.
Okay, good afternoon.
He said I did great too.
Okay, first, thank you, Senator Stabenow, Tester, King, and Kaine for coming. And just two little points before we get into the substance. Last night, you may have seen, Senator McConnell tried to Rule 14, 18 gotcha amendments. He was trying to say, see, Democrats, you're not going to like 50 votes. I challenged him and asked unanimous consent that we have 50 votes on those 18, plus the Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Act, and of course, he objected. So we're not afraid of 50 votes. We want 50 votes, and McConnell's gotcha activity didn't quite work. And then this morning, I was on the floor and I saw Senator Cornyn with a big sign. It said 94% of the people thought voting was easy in 2020. So I guess Senator Cornyn believes that the big lie, that the election was jaundiced, is false. Because if you say 2020 went well, you're saying two things. You're saying Trump's big lie is wrong, and you're saying that 2020 was fine. Why are legislatures changing it all across the country? Our argument is not that 2020 wasn't a fair election. We believe it was. Our argument is what they're doing now is going to make 2022 a very unfair election. So, we have a revolutionary idea. When you make it easier for people to cast their ballots safely, Americans turn out to vote. That's what our history showed. Of course, it's not what Donald Trump says. He says the election was stolen from him. It wasn't. He lost 7 million votes. He said that there was fraud. But John Cornyn's sign says, oh, no, the election was good in 2020. So he hasn't proven any fraud at all, or any degree of fraud that comes close to the 7 million votes he lost by. Even now, as I said, Republicans are talking about how 94% of Americans said voting was easy in 2020. Great. Let's keep it that way. But why then are Republican state legislatures, like those in Georgia and Texas and a lot of other places, passing laws in 2021 that makes it harder to vote? It's because, frankly, they're simply following Donald Trump's big lie. Republicans talk out of both sides of their mouth. They're saying voting in 2020 was easy, but the Senate cannot act to prevent states from making it harder to vote in 2022 or 2024. That's just lunacy. Republicans are tying themselves in knots, trying to convince Americans the big lie is really what Democrats are doing. That's what McConnell started saying. That's a little standard technique of theirs. They take something like they use dark money and they say Democrats are dark money, which is, you know, ridiculous. We're trying to end dark money in the Freedom to Vote Act. And now he says Democrats have the big lie. That's gaslighting. What McConnell did on the big lie is a classic definition of gaslighting. And, of course, we're not going to stand for it, and we rebut it. Americans are seeing what's happening across the country. They see in states like Georgia it's a crime to give food and water to people waiting in lines at the polls, and Senator Warnock reminded us that in the minority areas the lines are much, much longer than in a lot of the white suburban areas. Americans see states like Texas, Iowa, Montana having reduced polling locations and hours. In Georgia, according to the Atlanta Constitution, listen to this, the number of drop boxes in the 4 large Atlanta counties will drop from 111 to 23. How does that reduce voter fraud? It's ridiculous. We know what they're doing. They're making it harder to vote, particularly for people of color, for young people, for disabled people, for people who live in urban areas. Okay? One of the justifications that they used in Georgia is the boxes are no longer helpful. This ignores the fact that 300,000 voters used them in 2020. 300,000. So, we in the Senate are going to pass real solutions. We're going to work to pass real solutions that go to the heart of the problem. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And every senator is going to have to make a choice, plain and simple, about how to preserve our democratic republic. We had a very sobering, even frightening discussion today with two professors from Harvard who wrote, what is it, How Democracies Die, Levitsky and another nice man, Ziblatt? Yes. Ziblatt. And it was sobering. And the Republican Party is moving in that direction right now, at least according to their research, like other parties that have abandoned democracy in other parts of the world. With that, let me call on Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you, Senator Schumer. First, let me just take us back to last week where we remembered the horrible day a year ago when our capital and our democracy was attacked. Even after the broken glass was swept away and the black metal fence came down, the threat remains, and that's why we are here speaking about this. The attack on our democracy was sparked by a big lie concocted by the loser of the election and fueled by a network of his supporters. And they're not going to stop at anything to undermine our democracy. They've made it very clear. They attacked the Capitol on January 6, 2021. They're organizing at the state level to change the rules, take away the freedom to vote. At least 19 states passed 34 restrictive laws last year. They've got more than 100 bills to further restrict voting, have been introduced at the state legislative level and continued into this year. It's not only happening in Georgia, it's happening in Michigan as well. Republicans in my state are trying to change the system to make it harder to vote. We, in 2018, made a number of reforms in absentee balloting and other things to make it easier for people to vote. And people voted in 2020, the largest voter turnout ever in the history of Michigan. And people voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to be our president and vice president. And so, yes, it was easier. And yes, people voted. The problem is the Republicans didn't like who we voted for. And now they are trying to change the process and make it worse. And they're working overtime to put election board officials in place that are going to take their direction from Donald Trump and Republican leaders rather than certify our elections based on facts. In other words, based on who received the most votes. And we came very close in Michigan. If it was not for one courageous Republican who joined the Democrats on the state election board to certify the vote, it would have been a very different story in Michigan and possibly nationally. And the Republicans in Michigan want to make sure that that doesn't happen again, that they actually control those members. Republicans in Congress are standing by. They're allowing this to happen. And we are fighting back. It's time to pass the Freedom to Vote Act. We've watched the Senate rules continually be abused by the Republican leader for way too long. And it's time to step up and restore the Senate so this body reflects the majority rule that was intended by the founders of our Constitution. It's our job to do everything we can to protect our democracy and our freedom to vote, and that's what we are doing.
Thank you. Senator Tester.
Thanks, Chuck, and I want to thank my fellow senators for being here, and I want to thank you guys for being here. Look, we're our strongest in this nation when we're inclusive, when we bring everybody in. And what we've seen since the 2020 election is we've seen state by state pass laws to restrict voting, fencing people away from the polls. It's a great way to ruin a democracy. It's a great way to tear this country apart by sowing division. As my friend Angus King has said many, many times, and probably say it today, democracies are the exception in this world and have been forever. And the work that our forefathers have done to get us to where we are today required a lot of sacrifice and a lot of work. What we're seeing being done on a totally partisan basis is we're seeing restrictions being put on specific groups of voters that, quite frankly, will tear this democracy apart. I don't say that as an overstatement. I say that as a fact. And it is incumbent upon us today to make sure that we restore people's ability to vote and not have to stand in line for 10 hours or not to have to produce certain IDs that will work and other IDs that won't, which is what has happened in Montana. In the end, we need to have a vote on this, and I think now is the time. I know many of you have asked me in the halls, when are we going to vote? What's this going to happen? We got the big guy behind me. He can answer all those questions. But the truth is that we need to fix a problem in this country that could literally destroy our democracy. And if we don't, shame on us. Shame on us as a body. Like I said before, there's a lot of folks, a lot of smart people that wrote a lot of smart documents and a lot of smart laws that have gotten us where we are today. And we need to not take that for granted, and we need to move forward in a thoughtful way that makes sure that people can vote safely and accurately in this nation. And I think that's what the Freedom to Vote Act is all about.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Senator Kaine.
In the winter of 1891, the House of Representatives passed a voting rights bill to protect the rights of African Americans to vote. Very simple proposition. It was filibustered in the Senate and it died. And what we saw was 75 years of constraint on the rights of African Americans to vote. I know about that because I grew up in Virginia. I saw it. I saw it. I saw the effect that it had on my black friends and neighbors. There's an old hymn we used to sing in St. Paul's Church over in Alexandria, a Protestant hymn. Once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide. That is the moment that we're at right now. The point I want to make is that that vote in 1891 changed American history for the worse for 75 years. A few people changed American history for the worst in 1891. I don't want to see us make that mistake again. And I come at this a little differently than my colleagues. Sorry, Chuck. I don't know what the effect will be of ensuring a broader franchise in this country politically. Tim Kaine will tell you that in Virginia, they expanded the franchise last year, and they just elected a Republican governor for the first time in about a dozen years. So this isn't about electing Democrats or not electing Republicans. This is about preserving democracy with a small d. I have been very reluctant since being here to talk at all about changing the filibuster. And if we were here today talking about a policy issue, I wouldn't be at this podium. But we're not talking about a policy issue. We're talking about a structural issue. We're talking about how our system works. And the problem is, if it's corrupted, if it's compromised, then the voters can't change things even if they want to. And a lot of my colleagues and myself are worried about, okay, if you change the filibuster, what happens the next time when somebody else is in the majority? Well, the answer is if they're in the majority and they overreach, as long as the system is working, the voters can throw them out the next time. There's always an election in 2 years. But if the election itself is compromised, then that check, that essential democratic check, and that is the essential check in the Constitution, is regular elections. If that check is compromised, the system doesn't work. Finally, I find it a rich irony that we are here discussing and debating the principle of bipartisanship. I got a text from one of my colleagues in the Republican Party about the principle of bipartisanship, which I believe in. I believe that we should work whenever possible on a bipartisan basis, just as we did on the infrastructure bill. But it's ironic in the extreme to enshrine the principle of bipartisanship here in the Senate to the extent that we can't repair damage done to the democracy by 100% partisan legislatures around the state. In other words, if bipartisanship is a principle here in Washington, it ought to be in Atlanta and Concord and the other state capitals in the country, in Austin. So I'm all for bipartisanship, but in this situation, that doesn't seem to be in the offing. We've been working on this for a year, and we've had virtually no reach out, no discussion of dealing with these issues that are in the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So I'll return to the beginning. I believe that the vote taken this week is the most important vote that I will ever take in my life. Not because of any issue, but because of the structure of democracy itself. Democracy is fragile. It's unusual. The great British historian Arnold Toynbee said, civilizations commit suicide, they're not murdered. I don't want to see that happen in the United States of America.
Thank you, Angus. Tim.
So just two stories. And I first want to thank Chuck Schumer for asking me to be part of this group really beginning last May. Two stories. I lived in a military dictatorship in Honduras in 1980 and 81, and nobody could vote for anything. And I had taken it for granted before then, but living there and seeing how much people wanted to be able to choose their own leaders, it made me think a lot about what a democracy is. And one of the real traits of a functioning democracy is the ability to correct mistakes. Because democracies aren't any more perfect than any other form of government, but what a democracy gives you is the ability to correct mistakes. Now, throughout our history, we've made a lot of mistakes. But one of the ways we've tried to protect against mistakes is broadening those who could participate. Before African Americans could vote, we did cruel institutions like slavery. Before women could vote, we did all kinds of things that were anti-women. Before young people could vote, we did things that weren't good for young people. Our nation has been on a path where as we've expanded the franchise and abilities of people to participate, we expand our ability to recognize a mistake and in the next election sweep folks out, put somebody new in who will do something right. In the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it was not only that African American turnout dramatically increased, but studies show that the number of African Americans who could run for office and get elected dramatically increased. And when that happened, African American communities that had suffered historic disinvestment, suddenly politicians had to pay attention to them. A functioning democracy gives you the ability to correct mistakes. Shrinking who can participate, putting burdens and obstacles in folks' way, it's not only harmful to those individuals whose rights are being taken away, but it dramatically weakens the ability of a functioning electorate to correct mistakes and change courses. And that is what's going on in these jurisdictions all over the country. The second story I want to tell you, and Angus alluded to it, is it looks like Leader Schumer, I know this is disappointing to you. We've tried every possible way we could to get Republicans on these bills. Just debate. We'll give you unlimited amendments. Make us a counteroffer. We've tried everything we can, and save for Lisa Murkowski being willing to vote on a motion to proceed to the Lewis bill, we can't get them. So that makes the other side say, see this as a partisan effort. To the contrary, it's not partisan at all. The provisions of these bills are popular, but also just go to Virginia history. In November 2019, Democrats took both houses of the Virginia legislature. And one of the first things they did was dramatically expand the right of people to participate in Virginia elections. And we went from 45th in the nation in ease of voting to about 4th in the nation in 1 year. And we just had a governor's race. And the turnout increased 25% from the 2017 governor's race to 2021, and a Republican won. That was not my candidate. That was not my preferred outcome. But it was a win for small d democracy because having made it easier for people to participate, guess what they did? That was the second greatest jump in gubernatorial turnout in Virginia history. The first was between 1965 and 1969, when the turnout went up by 65%, and my father-in-law was elected governor, Linwood Holton. 65% increase in turnout between 1965 and 1969. Why? Because Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court in Harper versus Virginia in 1966 struck down use of poll taxes as a condition for state elections. So fancy that. You make it easier for people to vote, and you pull obstacles out of their way, and a whole lot more people vote, and guess what? It can be good for Republicans, and then maybe some elections it's not. It can be good for Democrats, maybe some elections it's not, but it's good for democracy, and that's why we need to do this.
Thank you. Eloquent speeches. I'll start that way and work my way over. You're first.
Can you shed some light on what filibuster changes or change will be voted on in the Senate?
Look, we are looking at a variety. The group here, particularly Tim and Angus and John, who have been part of that group of three, we are exploring a variety of different changes that can get 50 votes. That's what we're working on very diligently, almost 24/7 now.
Senator, you clearly don't have Joe Manchin on board, you don't have Kit and Sinema on board. They've been very clear they do not support going to the nuclear option. So why go through this exercise, force your members, your vulnerable members, to cast a vote to change the rules when you know it's not going to pass?
Okay, I'd say three things. First, we're still working to get it done. And we are still having, as we speak, active discussions with both Senators Manchin and Sinema. There's a 50-person discussion here. That's number one. Number two, this is so important. Job of a senator is to vote. And the more important and pressing the issue is, the more that plays. We are going to vote.
If you don't mind, I have a question for you and separately for the group. For you, you talk about how important this is, but I can think of any number of issues. You've called climate change an urgent crisis, an existential threat, a lot of the same language. Why is it carve out on voting rights an urgent crisis?
Because this relates to all the others. You've heard it from every one of us here. This is the structure of democracy. Climate change, you name it. Climate change, family rights, gay rights, union rights, all of these things are directly related to the right to vote. You change the right to vote, you jaundice the right to vote, you affect all of these. Go ahead. Nope. One question. Well, go ahead. One question at a time. Go ahead, DeBonis.
You said for a year failure is not an option on this
Right.
issue. If we take Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema at their words, it seems that failure is
Well, failure is not an option for the country. That's the point. It is so important. You've heard what we've said. Failure is not an option for the democracy of America. Yes.
Can you guarantee, just to follow up on Lonnie's question, can you guarantee a vote by Monday on rules changes?
We are voting on or before MLK Day on the bills and on rules changes.
If you don't have 50 votes by this Monday deadline, then why set this Monday deadline if you don't
We're
have
running out of time because these legislatures are passing terrible laws, and our experts have told us moving by mid-January is about the latest we can go. Yes.
Wanted to ask you about a different topic, stock trades, specifically the idea of banning members of Congress and their spouses from trading stocks while in office. He rejected the idea last month. There are reports this morning that McCarthy is in favor of the idea. This issue is widely popular with voters, and so I'm wondering what you think about that idea and whether Democrats are going to...
Look, I haven't seen what McCarthy said, but I don't own any stocks, and I think that's the right thing to do. Yes, next.
Back on voting rights, when do you plan on filing cloture, and when will a rules vote happen?
This week you will see much more about the schedule. We've been waiting for the president's speech. That'll happen this afternoon, and then you will begin to see the schedule. Let me call on you, Garrett. You get your question for the other people. Okay. Go ahead.
All four of you signed his letter back in 2017 saying you would oppose changes to the filibuster, that it was important to protect minorities' rights to input and all this. I know you feel this bill is particularly important, but I just came from a Republican press conference where they called all of you hypocrites for changing your view on that, and I'm curious what you say to that.
My quick answer is because this is about democracy, not about policy. I answered that in my remark.
And let me say that as somebody who signed that at the time, we were not where we are today. We're in terms of this continual abuse, really the tyranny of the minority using the filibuster, And on top of that, a violent attempt to overthrow an election and a national strategy now, a partisan strategy in Michigan, in places across the country, to literally take away people's freedom to vote. So this has changed. I care passionately about climate change and about other issues, but this is fundamentally about whether or not people in our country will have the freedom to vote and whether or not we'll have a democracy.
Can I just say on this, if they were having this press conference that they did today, back in the 1780s, they'd call James Madison a hypocrite. James Madison was asked to draft the Constitution, and he didn't believe that there should be a Bill of Rights. Then he saw Baptist ministers getting persecuted because they weren't Church of England in Orange County where he lived. And he decided, I guess maybe we need a Bill of Rights. That letter was written before one of the largest efforts in the history of this country to disenfranchise voters. It wasn't just an attack on January 6th. It was for a particular purpose, to disenfranchise 80 million people. And this Senate hardly is worth the name Senate if it's unwilling to respond to something like that. And so, yeah, I did write that in 2017, and I wrote it sincerely. But based on what we've seen, I feel like the rational response of anybody is to try to protect the democracy, and that's what these voting rights bills do.
Just really quickly, and that is, this is really important for our democracy, number one. Number two, don't think for a second that China and Russia isn't paying real attention to this and meddling where they can. And number three, we're not talking about doing away with the filibuster. We're talking about restoring the Senate to the good old days of Mr. Smith goes to Washington, and there's a talking filibuster that, by the way, gives the minority an incredible amount of power. If they come in and they say, all right, Schumer, you want to bring this bill up? We're going to hold the floor for 40 days. And you could under these rules pretty easily under the situation we have now. And so I think this is fair. And by the way, that will cause Schumer to come to the table. It will cause McConnell to come to the table. It will cause me to come to the table. It will cause Steve Daines to come to the table, and we'll get an agreement. I think it's good for bipartisanship, and I think it's essential for the country.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.